Once upon a time, a humble couple lived in a small house surrounded by blooming fields. Despite their modest life, they longed for something no material wealth could provide: a child. For many years, this dream seemed unattainable until one day, the woman finally became pregnant. However, her joy was soon overshadowed by a desire as intense as it was inexplicable. She began to crave rampions desperately, vibrant green plants that grew in the neighboring garden. This garden, however, was no ordinary place. It belonged to a powerful sorceress, feared by everyone in the region. Day by day, the woman's craving grew stronger, consuming her health and reason. "If I don't eat rampions," she told her husband, "I will die." The man, desperate for his wife's love and the life of their unborn child, decided to risk everything. In the dead of night, he climbed the wall of the enchanted garden and, with trembling hands, picked a few leaves. His wife devoured them with such voracity that she soon demanded more. He returned the following night, and as he reached out to pick the forbidden plant again, he heard a voice cold and sharp as ice. "How dare you steal from my garden?" It was the sorceress. Her eyes burned with a supernatural fury, and the man fell to his knees, begging for mercy. He explained his wife's desperation and her uncontrollable craving. The sorceress listened in silence, but there was a cruel glint in her expression as she formulated her response. "You may take as much as you want, but there will be a price. When the child is born, it will be mine." The man, cornered and terrified, agreed without thinking of the consequences. He brought the rampion home, but the dark pact was already sealed. When the baby was born, a beautiful girl with golden hair, the sorceress came to claim her without hesitation. "Her name will be Rapunzel, like the rampion that brought her to me." And so, the little Rapunzel was torn from her parents' arms and taken away to a destiny marked by isolation and absolute control. Faithful to her pact, the sorceress disappeared with the newborn in her arms. Rapunzel grew up under her care, but care is not the same as love. The sorceress did not see the girl as a daughter but as a possession, something beautiful and precious that needed to be hidden from the world. As Rapunzel grew, her beauty became increasingly extraordinary, especially her golden hair, which fell in waves to the ground like strands of living gold. Fearing that someone might steal the girl, the sorceress decided to isolate her completely. When Rapunzel was only 12 years old, she was taken to a tower in the middle of a dark forest. The tower was tall and imposing, with no doors or stairs, just a small window at the top. High above, Rapunzel was locked away. The sorceress visited her daily, calling from the base of the tower, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair for me," and Rapunzel obeyed. Over time, her long hair became her only connection to the outside world. The sorceress climbed up and down using the hair as a rope, keeping Rapunzel imprisoned both physically and emotionally. In the solitude of the tower, Rapunzel spent her days singing. Her voice was so pure and moving that it seemed to carry the emotions suppressed by her isolation. But to the sorceress, that singing was merely proof that Rapunzel was exactly where she belonged, out of reach of anyone. Time passed, and Rapunzel grew more curious about the world outside. Yet the tower was her prison, and her only visitor, the sorceress, refused to answer her questions. However, fate has its ways of intertwining lives. Rapunzel's melancholy singing, carried by the wind, reached the ears of a prince riding through the forest. He followed the voice until he found the tower hidden among the trees. Fascinated, the prince began to observe from a distance, until one day he saw the sorceress call out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair for me." When he saw the witch climb the girl's hair, the prince knew he had to act. He waited for the right moment to approach the mysterious owner of that enchanting voice. The prince could not forget the melody he had heard coming from that tower. There was something in Rapunzel's voice that touched him deeply, as if each note carried a plea for freedom. He spent days returning to that place, observing the tower, and trying to figure out how to reach the young woman. Finally, one night he saw the sorceress arrive. Hidden among the shadows of the trees, he heard her call, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair for me." When he saw the long golden hair descend from the window and the sorceress climb it, the prince understood the secret of the tower. He waited until the witch left and, with his heart pounding, approached the base of the structure. Mimicking the call he had heard, he spoke in a voice firm but full of care, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair for me." Unaware that it was a stranger, Rapunzel let her hair down from the window. As the prince began to climb, the young woman felt a mix of curiosity and fear. Who was this person climbing her tower, if not the sorceress? When he reached the top, the prince saw Rapunzel for the first time. She was even more beautiful than her voice had made him imagine, with golden hair that shone in the moonlight. Rapunzel, on the other hand, had never seen another human besides the sorceress. The prince seemed unlike anything she knew, and his presence left her bewildered. "Who are you?" Rapunzel asked, stepping back a little. The prince smiled gently and replied, "I am someone who heard your voice and was guided here. I didn't mean to frighten you. I just wanted to meet the one who sings with such beauty." Rapunzel, despite her inexperience, sensed sincerity in his words. They talked for hours, and the prince told her about the world outside. Forests, kingdoms, celebrations, and freedom. Each word was like a window opening to a universe Rapunzel had never imagined. That night, something changed inside her. The tower that once seemed inevitable now felt like a prison. The prince promised to return, and together, they began planning her escape. But Rapunzel knew it would not be easy to deceive the sorceress, whose watchfulness was constant. Yet the thought of freedom, so close, was sweeter than any fear. The next night, the prince returned to the tower, just as he had promised. He called for Rapunzel, and upon recognizing his voice, she eagerly let down her golden hair. Climbing quickly, the prince brought not just words of comfort but also a plan. He had thought of a way to free her from the tower and from the sorceress who kept her isolated. "Rapunzel, I will bring a piece of silk with me on each visit," he explained. "You can weave it into a long rope strong enough to climb down and escape with me." The young woman, who had never before disobeyed the sorceress, felt her heart race at the prince's words. The idea of escaping was as terrifying as it was enticing. She knew that if the witch discovered their plan, her revenge would be merciless. But the prince's presence, so different from the coldness of the sorceress, gave her hope that perhaps there was life beyond the stone walls. However, the prince's visits did not go unnoticed. Rapunzel, so innocent and naive, did not understand the need to hide their secret carefully. One morning, as the sorceress climbed the tower, Rapunzel, distracted, made a comment that would seal her fate. "Stepmother Gothel, how much heavier you are than the prince. When he climbs, it is so much easier to pull him up." The sorceress's blood ran cold. Her calculating eyes now burned with fury. She screamed, "The prince! You've betrayed me, you ungrateful girl." Without another word, the sorceress, consumed by rage, cut off Rapunzel's long hair, leaving her with short, uneven strands. She held the severed braids with a look of cruel triumph. "You think you can deceive me?" she roared. "Now, you'll pay the price for your insolence." That same night, the sorceress took Rapunzel to a distant desert, abandoning her there, alone, without food or protection. As for the prince, he had no idea what awaited him. When he returned to the tower to fetch Rapunzel and called for her, the sorceress, holding the cut braids in her hands, awaited him. "Climb up, fool," she said, mimicking the girl's sweet voice. Suspecting nothing, the prince climbed the hair. But upon reaching the top, he found himself face to face with the witch, whose cruel smile reflected her victory. "Your little bird has flown away," she sneered, "and you will never see her again." The prince, overwhelmed by despair, tried to flee, but in his haste, he slipped from the tower window and fell into the thorny bushes below. The thorns pierced his eyes, blinding him. He began to wander the world, blind and alone, his heart shattered, calling for Rapunzel, not knowing where she was. While the prince roamed the vastness of the world, blind, Rapunzel faced the desolation of the desert. The sorceress had abandoned her in an arid land where the sun scorched the cracked ground and the nights were cold and silent. There, with no one to protect or help her, the young woman had to learn to survive alone. Time passed, and Rapunzel discovered she carried a reminder of her bond with the prince. She was pregnant. With strength born of a lost love and the instinct to protect the life growing inside her, she endured hunger, thirst, and despair. When the time came, alone and without assistance, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. The children brought a small ray of hope to her isolated life. Even in the midst of the desert, their laughter and presence kept her strong. But still, she longed for the prince. Every day, she looked to the empty horizon, hoping for a miracle to reunite them. Meanwhile, the prince wandered aimlessly, guided only by the sound of his own sorrow. He wept endlessly, and his tears, streaming down his wounded face, never seemed to ease the pain in his heart. He called for Rapunzel, but no one answered. For years, he lived as a beggar, relying on the kindness of strangers to survive. Though he could no longer see, his memory still held Rapunzel's image and her sweet voice. Even without knowing where she was, he refused to give up. It was as if an invisible thread connected them, pulling him closer and closer to the desert where she lived. Fate, which had cruelly separated them, began to move its pieces to reunite them once more. After years of suffering, fate finally guided the prince to the desert where Rapunzel lived. He was weak, thin, and his bare feet were wounded from his endless wandering. But something within him, a silent, inexplicable call, pushed him forward, even when it seemed impossible to go on. One morning, as the prince walked, the sound of children's laughter broke the desert silence. He stopped, his heart racing. He recognized that laughter. It was familiar in a way he could not explain. Guided by the sound, he approached a small clearing among the dunes. There, in the shade of a withered tree, he heard a voice. Rapunzel's voice, singing to soothe her children. "Rapunzel!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and full of emotion. Rapunzel froze for a moment. That name, spoken in that way, was something she had not heard in so long. When she looked at the figure approaching, she recognized the prince, despite his worn appearance. "Is it you?" she asked, her voice trembling. He followed the sound of her voice, stumbling until he fell to his knees before her. Even though he could not see her, he reached out, and she held his hands, tears streaming down her face. "It's me, Rapunzel. I've searched for you all these years," he said as warm tears ran from his blind eyes. Moved by emotion, Rapunzel embraced him tightly. Then, as if their shared love and suffering held a power of its own, Rapunzel's tears fell onto the prince's face. When one of her tears touched his wounded eyes, a miracle occurred. His sight was restored. The prince blinked, confused, until he finally saw Rapunzel's face. She looked different, more mature and marked by her years in the desert, but she was still the same woman he loved. Beside her, he saw two children, the twins who were the fruit of their love. In that moment, all the pain they had endured seemed to fade away. The prince embraced Rapunzel and their children, promising never to be separated again. Now reunited, Rapunzel and the prince decided to leave the desert behind. Guided by their renewed love and the promise of a better life, they began the journey back to the prince's kingdom. The journey was long and arduous, but this time, they had something they had not before: hope. Rapunzel, who had learned to survive through hardship, cared for their children while the prince led the small group through forests and villages. When they finally arrived at the kingdom, the prince was welcomed with joy and amazement. Many had thought him dead, but there he was, bringing with him his wife and children. The people quickly grew fond of Rapunzel's kindness and strength, and she was embraced as their princess. In the palace, they finally found peace. The years of suffering became distant memories, and Rapunzel and the prince ruled together with justice and compassion. Their children grew up surrounded by love, and the story of their union became a legend among the kingdom's peasants and nobles alike. The original tale of Rapunzel, though dark, carries profound lessons. It reminds us that true love is resilient and that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance for redemption. However, it also warns against the dangers of obsession and control, as demonstrated by the sorceress, whose desire to possess and isolate Rapunzel led to her downfall. Thus, the story of Rapunzel, marked by pain and overcoming, became a symbol of hope and transformation, showing that even in the most desolate situations, there is room for love to triumph.